An atheist teacher issued a challenge to debate about Islam, posing 15 difficult questions and claiming he would convert to Islam if anyone could answer them all correctly. A Muslim student, feeling offended by such a statement, responded with great intelligence and managed to captivate the entire audience. This intense debate left those present impressed by the clarity and depth of her answers. Share this fascinating story, and may those who subscribe receive blessings on their path. At the University of the California Institute, a prestigious institution, an event was about to take place that would be recorded in its history. The main auditorium of the campus, usually used for regular classes, was packed with hundreds of students from different faculties. With an expectant murmur, everyone shared the same goal: to attend the masterclass of a true living legend of philosophy, Professor Richard Parker. Professor Parker was no stranger in academic circles. His profound knowledge of philosophy and logic had earned him widespread recognition. However, one aspect of his personality sparked controversy: his firm conviction as a declared atheist. For years, he had become someone capable of questioning the beliefs of many students, especially Muslims, with sharp and hard-to-refute arguments. But that day, Parker would not limit himself to talking about philosophy. His intention was to test religious beliefs, especially Islam, in an unprecedented way. Wearing a black suit and walking with determined steps, he took the stage. All eyes focused on him, and in an instant, the audience's murmur turned into absolute silence. He adjusted the microphone and, in a firm voice, declared, "Today, I will not only question religion. My goal is to debunk the last myth that humanity still holds." Then he raised a copy of the Quran and, fixing his gaze on the audience, added, "I will pose 15 questions about the Quran that no one will be able to answer logically. And if anyone manages to answer all of them, I promise I will convert to Islam right here and now." The auditorium filled with laughter and murmurs. None of those present dared to intervene. Some Muslim students who had previously debated with Parker lowered their heads. They knew the sharpness of his reasoning and how difficult it would be to give satisfactory answers. Tension grew, and the atmosphere in the room seemed heavier. Suddenly, from the back rows, a student wearing a hijab stood up. She wore a dark blue tunic and a modest backpack on her back. Her face, serene yet firm, radiated confidence as she walked toward the stage. Her name was Mira Adela. She was in her 3rd year of biotechnology and was the only Muslim willing to confront Professor Parker. All eyes turned to her. The classroom fell into complete silence, and her slow steps to the front seemed to stretch every moment. Seeing her, Parker smiled with a hint of irony. "Wow, how bold! Do you really think you can defend that book with your naive rhetoric?" Mira ignored the sarcasm and looked at him calmly and confidently. "I didn't come to defend," she replied in a calm but firm voice. "I came to explain." Her words immediately struck those listening. There was no arrogance or intention to impose herself, just a simple and profound statement. A faculty moderator tried to intervene, but Parker dismissed him with disdain. "Leave her, this will be brief. 15 questions, 15 defeats." With an air of arrogance, he placed the Quran on the table, opened it at random, and leaned back confidently. "Very well, let's begin," he said with a sly smile. But that day would not be an occasion to reinforce Professor Parker's pride. Instead, it would be the moment when a calm voice rose above the tide of mockery and debate, not to humiliate, but to touch hearts. In an auditorium filled with skepticism, the seed of truth began to sprout thanks to a young woman who feared neither intellectual pressure nor biting remarks. Parker crossed his arms, fixed his gaze on Mira, and said, "Well, Mira Adela, first question. How could Muhammad, an illiterate man in the 7th century desert, detail the stages of fetal development in the womb without medical training. The tension was palpable. The students held their breath as Parker projected on a large screen a passage from the Quran, Surah Al-Mu'minun, verses 12 to 14. All eyes were on Mira, awaiting her response. Her words shook the atmosphere of the auditorium. No one could contradict or challenge them. Professor Parker, confident that he had set a trap to question Myra's faith, began to feel out of control. He tried to change strategy. "Second question," he said in a sharper tone. "If the Quran truly comes from God, how is it that it states the universe is expanding? This is an idea only confirmed in the 20th century." Mira answered without hesitation. In the Quran, Surah Az-Zariyat, verse 47, it says, "And the heaven we constructed with might, and indeed we are expanding it." Professor, this is a clear statement about the expansion of the cosmos. Even the astronomer Edwin Hubble reached the same conclusion only in 1929. She spoke calmly, yet with full understanding. Some students lowered their gaze, unable to hide their admiration for the clarity of her explanation. A physics student in the left row remained silent, reflecting. Professor Parker tried to interrupt, but Mira continued serenely. Precisely because he could not explain it scientifically, this proves that these words could not have come from a man. The Quran was not written by someone, but revealed. Modern science is only now catching up to what the Quran expressed 1,400 years ago. Mira spoke with a serenity and confidence that not only dismantled any argument, but also generated admiration among all present. At that moment, it became clear that the debate was not only about reason but about hearts willing to recognize the truth. Feeling somewhat cornered, Professor Parker asked the third question, showing a slight hesitation. The Quran in Surah Ar-Rahman says that two seas meet but do not mix. That's a metaphor, not a real fact. On the contrary, Professor, it is a fact, Mira replied calmly. In Surah Ar-Rahman, verses 19 and 20, it states, "He let two seas flow which meet, but between them is a barrier that neither overcomes." In oceanography, this phenomenon is known as a halocline, where salt water and fresh water meet but do not mix due to differences in density and surface tension. In the back rows of the auditorium, several students began hurriedly taking notes, astonished by Myra's answer, which was not only solid and coherent but also backed by scientific evidence. Parker, trying to maintain his stance, began to feel the frustration of facing such a logical and well-founded explanation. He continued with another question he had already prepared. The Quran states that humans were created from clay. Isn't this simply an ancient myth full of symbolism? Mira answered confidently. It is not a myth. The essential components of the human body, such as carbon, calcium, iron, and others, come from elements found in the earth. Even NASA scientists have pointed out that the constituents of the human body originate both from stardust and terrestrial minerals. Her words caused a murmur in the room. Not applause, but glances shifting from skepticism to admiration. Even Professor Parker, usually so self-assured, remained silent, processing such a solid and hard-to-contradict response. Mira, having already successfully defended her presentation on the expansion of the universe, prepared for Parker's next question. Though he seemed more unsettled, he still tried to maintain his stance. "Perhaps it's just a poetic coincidence," he said, glancing at the screen showing the Quranic quote. "There's no evidence that Muhammad truly understood what he was saying." Firm in her conviction, Mira replied. "Precisely because he could not understand it from a scientific perspective. That proves these were not his own words. The Quran was not written by a man. It was revealed by God. Modern science is simply following the path the Quran indicated 1,400 years ago." Her words spread through the auditorium in absolute silence. Everyone sensed the serenity in her voice, but also the strength it emanated. Mira was not only defending Quranic passages but demonstrating that science and faith could coexist, complementing rather than opposing each other. Professor Parker, previously so confident in himself and his knowledge, began to show doubt. Perhaps he questioned whether he had underestimated that young student, or if his certainties about science and religion had just been tested by something greater than he could grasp. Gradually, Parker's authority weakened while Mira maintained her stance, responding with courage and firm conviction to every question. Hundreds of eyes followed her without blinking, watching her dismantle one by one the arguments that had once seemed indisputable. The tension in the auditorium rose, and all eyes remained fixed on Mira, making it clear who was truly dominating the debate. Parker, increasingly nervous, raised the question again about the two seas that meet without mixing. Mira looked at him determinedly. "That is indisputable, Professor. In Surah Ar-Rahman, verses 19 and 20, it mentions how two seas meet, but between them there is a barrier they do not cross. This is the phenomenon of a halocline, where waters of different density and surface tension remain separate." The room, which until that moment had been tense, began to fill with whispers. Some students discreetly discussed what they had just heard, while at the back, several invited professors quickly took notes, as if reconsidering beliefs they had held for years. Feeling cornered, Parker tried to maintain his stance. "Do you really think that's enough to prove your book comes from God?" he asked, with a hint of sarcasm, though now he sounded more hesitant. "It's not just my belief, Professor," Mira responded calmly. "Anyone who approaches with an open and sincere mind can see it. Scientific evidence does not need. Blind faith is nothing more than the honesty of accepting the truth when it is revealed to us." Those words hit Professor Parker like an unexpected slap, leaving him completely silent. The eyes of hundreds in the auditorium no longer saw her as just a student. They now perceived her as someone conveying truth from a sincere heart, with no intention to impose, but with the sole purpose of presenting what is right. The debate, growing more intense, moved toward the topic of humanity's origin. "Mira," intervened Professor Parker, "the Quran claims that humans were formed from clay. Isn't that an ancient myth full of symbolism?" Mira looked at him calmly. There was no anger or annoyance on her face, only profound serenity. "It is not a myth," she replied with absolute clarity. "The fundamental components of the human body, such as carbon, calcium, iron, among others, come from the same elements found in the earth. Even NASA scientists have pointed out in their research that the elements that constitute humans originate both from stardust and terrestrial minerals." Immediately, a murmur ran through the auditorium, not applause, but a quiet admiration that each person kept within. The students around Mira remained silent, as if reflecting on the depth of her answer. Those who had previously doubted her words could no longer deny the evidence. The facts she presented were so coherent, so concrete, and so compelling. Professor Parker, who had previously shown great self-confidence, now remained silent. The hand that a moment ago had arrogantly raised the Quran trembled slightly, as if sensing the weight of a question for which he had no answer. "Perhaps it's just a coincidence," he tried to evade, though his voice lacked its former firmness. "It's not a coincidence, Professor," Mira replied with a slight smile. "It is the truth that comes from God. Isn't authentic knowledge always leading us to the same source?" The tension in the auditorium was rising, yet Mira remained calm, answering each question with conviction. Feeling the pressure, Professor Parker tried to divert the topic. "Mira, what evidence do you have that this book has never been altered? Many other sacred scriptures have undergone revisions, edits, and modifications. Mira responded without hesitation. The Quran in Surah Al-Hijr verse 9 states, "Indeed we have sent down the Quran, and indeed we will preserve it." From the time of the Prophet until today, millions of people have memorized it. Even children in Africa and Asia can recite it word for word. The oldest manuscript found in Birmingham, England, has been carbon dated to the Prophet's era, and its content matches exactly what is read today. As she spoke these words, Mira felt enveloped in a profound calm. There was not a trace of doubt in her, and no one could contradict her. Everyone present in the auditorium sensed the clarity and unquestionable truth in each of her statements. Professor Parker looked visibly surprised. He had never expected a student to answer all his questions with such solid and logical arguments. He often debated others' beliefs without pausing to consider the depth of the responses, but now he was beginning to be impressed by the knowledge emanating from Mira. Amid the increasingly intense atmosphere, Parker tried to pose a question that would test Mira's firmness. If God is truly all-powerful and compassionate, why does he need to be worshipped? Why does he seem to desire human recognition? Mira replied in a calm voice, "Professor, God does not require the worship of humans. It is we who need to worship him so as not to lose ourselves in arrogance and emptiness." Her words touched everyone deeply. Ibadah, she continued, is the path that reminds us of our essence and protects the soul from moral decay. God has granted us free will, the ability to choose and reason. Worship is a process of purification that guides us toward virtue. Parker fell silent. For the first time during the debate, he perceived that there was something beyond the logic and reasoning to which he was accustomed. Mira's explanations, simple yet profound, had reached the innermost part of his being. With each answer, the room, which had been filled with doubt and skepticism, became imbued with a tranquility arising from genuine faith. Mira not only answered the professor's questions calmly, but also opened the hearts of everyone present, allowing them to glimpse a truth that had remained hidden until then. Determined not to give up, Parker posed another question, sharper and more challenging. If God is just and merciful, why does suffering exist in the world? Why do good people often face adversity while the wicked seem to live without concern? Mira looked at him with deep understanding. Hundreds of eyes were on her, yet she showed no sign of tension. On the contrary, she radiated absolute calm. "Professor, this world is not paradise," she replied softly but confidently. "This world is a place of trial." The Quran in Surah Al-Baqarah, verse 155, teaches us, "And we will surely test you with something of fear, hunger, loss of wealth, lives, and fruits." Suffering serves to assess the strength of the heart. Her voice filled the auditorium, and her words, simple yet full of meaning, flowed like a river calming a restless spirit. "Suffering does not exist to punish," she continued, "but to purify our inner self. Those who endure pain learn to cultivate patience, strength, and to value life in its entirety. We are not tested merely to survive, but to grow as individuals. Within suffering lie lessons we must decipher. In loss emerges genuine gratitude, and in despair, a spark of hope that never extinguishes." Tentative applause began to emerge from the corners of the room, discreet yet filled with silent respect and admiration. Mira spoke of suffering with serenity, conveying a rare wisdom. Professor Parker, once so confident and direct, now remained speechless. He felt trapped in a maze of answers that not only contradicted his arguments but touched his most human essence. Trying to regain the initiative, Parker posed a final, deeper, and more reflective question. If God is just and all-powerful, how do you interpret the concept of divine eternity from the perspective of existentialist philosophy? Is it possible that God also faces the search for his own existence, as humans do? Mira looked at him with complete assurance. She knew the question could be complex but showed no doubt. She responded serenely, as if she knew exactly what to say. Professor, God is a necessary being. He was not created. He has no beginning or end. In the Quran, Surah Al-Ikhlas, verses 1-4, it is presented clearly and logically. Say, He is God one, God the Absolute. He neither begets nor is born, and nothing is like him. With every word, she offered not just a verbal answer but conveyed a profound understanding of divinity. God is never in an existential search, Professor. He is an eternal presence, incomprehensible from a human perspective. According to the concept of Tawhid, the oneness of God, God encompasses all. Everything that exists emanates from him and everything will return to him. Speaking of God's eternity refers to an essence that transcends the barriers of time and space. Myra's words seemed to illuminate the darkness, providing clarity to those who had not understood before. Even Professor Parker, with all his philosophical knowledge, remained silent, as if suddenly recognizing that he had misunderstood the true nature of divinity. He felt trapped in limited thought, constrained by the bounds of human reason, unaware that a broader dimension existed beyond his logic. The next challenge arose with greater intensity. Professor Parker, although beginning to feel cornered, still tried to maintain his intellectual authority. Mira, if God is one, how do you explain that in other religions such as Christianity, there is the notion of the Trinity? Doesn't this conflict with the idea of God's oneness? Mira looked at him with understanding, perceiving the intent behind the question. Professor, we respect the beliefs of other religions, but in Islam we hold that God is one, without partners, without children, and without having been begotten. The Trinity in Christianity, while significant for those who follow it, does not align with the concept of Tawhid that we practice. For us, God is one, indivisible, and without multiplicity of forms or manifestations. Calmly, Mira continued. In Islam, God is completely independent. He is the creator and sovereign of all, not limited by space or time. While the Trinity divides divinity into three, in our faith God remains one and requires no associates. Our understanding of the divine cannot be confined solely to human reason, but involves accepting that God is absolute, and everything depends solely on him. Myra's response combined firmness with delicacy. She did not reject the teachings of other religions, yet clearly expressed what she herself believed. Every word she spoke conveyed a sense of peace, bringing serenity to those listening with an open heart. Professor Parker, though beginning to show signs of hesitation, tried to continue with another question. Mira, if God is completely just, why are there verses in the Quran indicating that a woman inherits half of what a man receives? Isn't that unjust? Mira observed him attentively. I know this is an issue many use as a stumbling block due to not understanding the context of the Quran. With a calm voice she added, Professor, in Islam, inheritance is distributed according to the responsibilities each person must assume. Men carry greater financial burdens within the family. They are responsible for supporting their wives and children. Therefore, their portion of the inheritance is larger. Women do not have that same obligation. She added, Still, women in Islam are treated with great respect. They have the right to inherit and are never considered inferior to men. In many aspects, Islam recognizes rights for women that other cultures of the time did not grant. In many ways, it elevates the female position, making her role in society valuable and indispensable. Myra's explanation stood out for its clarity and depth. She did not limit herself to analyzing the legal aspect of inheritance, but also invited reflection beyond the Islamic framework, which recognizes and respects women. Her intervention led several students to reconsider their perception of the female role in society, and better understand the importance of placing each teaching in its proper context. The next question proved even more complex. Mira, what is said about polygamy? Isn't it a form of oppression toward women? Mira paused for a moment, then looked at Professor Parker. Islam does not impose polygamy, Professor. It simply permits it under very strict conditions. A man may marry multiple women only if he is able to treat them all fairly. Otherwise, it is forbidden. Islam prohibits injustice in this matter. In the Quran, Surah An-Nisa, verse 3, Allah states, "And if you fear that you will not be just, then marry only one." Therefore, polygamy in Islam is not a form of oppression but a valid measure under specific circumstances, as long as justice is maintained. Myra's answer was full of reason and discernment. She not only defended the principles of Islam but also offered an explanation of the social context supporting these rules. Polygamy is not mandatory. It is merely allowed under very specific circumstances with strict requirements. Mira presented this elegantly, without judging anyone, inviting those listening to gain a deeper understanding of a teaching often misinterpreted. Tension in the Westbridge University classroom increased, but Mira remained calm. Professor Parker, sensing he was increasingly cornered, sought another way to challenge her. He chose a topic that almost always sparks controversy: the position of women in Islam. With a sharper, more critical tone, he asked, "Mira, according to Islamic law, a woman can only act as a witness in certain cases, and her testimony is worth half that of a man. Isn't that discriminatory?" Mira replied without hesitation, "Professor, in Islam, female testimony is not entirely dismissed. For example, in matters of debt, 2 women are required to ensure the information is accurate. Why is this? Because in those times, women did not directly participate in financial transactions like men, so their involvement in such cases was crucial to ensure justice." With remarkable calm, she continued, "However, in many cases, female testimony is fully valued. If we look at Islamic history, figures like Aisha, Salamah, and many other female companions played essential roles in testifying and becoming teachers to many. They were considered as competent as men in knowledge and wisdom." Mira did not speak solely to defend Islam but also to emphasize that the position of women in Islamic teaching cannot be reduced to a simplistic interpretation. She explained in depth that the framework of Islamic law depends greatly on social and historical context, and on how Islam treats women with full respect, even elevating their status above many other cultures of the time. Myra's words began to touch the hearts of those in the classroom. Many students who initially questioned the role of women in Islam began to reconsider their views. They started to understand that female testimony in Islam does not represent discrimination but a recognition of women's active role in society. After correctly answering the question about female testimony, Professor Parker posed a deeper question. "Mira, in Islam, women cannot lead men in prayer. Isn't this a form of inequality? If Islam recognizes and respects women, why does this restriction exist?" Mira remained unshaken. She had anticipated this and responded calmly. "Professor, in Islam, men and women have different responsibilities based on their biological and psychological characteristics. Men cannot become pregnant or breastfeed, so their role in the family and society involves greater responsibilities, such as supporting the wife and children. However, this does not indicate that women are inferior. Rather, it reflects how Islam values and honors the natural function of women." With complete confidence, Mira added, Islam does not prevent women from being leaders in numerous fields. Aisha, the Prophet Muhammad's wife, was a respected figure with great influence in Islamic history. Even in scholarly fields, learned women like Salamah and others taught male companions and held positions of significant societal relevance. Women are not limited in their leadership capacity. They simply fulfill different roles in certain contexts. Mira pointed out that, within Islam, women retain the freedom to assume leadership roles in education and many other areas. She explained that the existing restrictions are not due to inequality, but rather recognize the natural role that women play in society. According to her explanation, Islam protects and dignifies the female position, granting respect and privileges that many contemporary cultures did not offer. Myra's words moved several students in the class. Those who had previously thought that Islam limited women began to understand that, in reality, it offers broad opportunities for development and active participation in society, without discrimination or strict restrictions, but with deep respect toward them. Professor Parker, feeling increasingly challenged in the debate, attempted to respond with a provocative question. If Islam is a just religion, why are there verses that seem to instruct killing unbelievers? Doesn't this contradict the message of peace that Islam preaches? Mira looked at him with understanding and replied, "Professor, those verses are often misinterpreted and were revealed in a context of war. The Quran, in Surah At-Tawbah, verse 5, which is frequently cited, refers to combat in specific situations, when Muslims were attacked or provoked. It does not constitute a general command to kill non-believers. Islam does not promote violence but self-defense. The Prophet Muhammad himself never initiated a war for conquest. He acted solely to protect himself and safeguard the faith." Mira continued, "Islam firmly rejects any unnecessary violence. In the Quran, Surah Al-Baqarah, verse 190, it says, "And fight in the way of Allah against those who fight you, but do not transgress. Indeed, Allah does not love transgressors. I speak clearly and fairly." Every passage of the Quran must be interpreted within its historical and social context. Islam advocates for peace and considers war only as a means of defense. Moreover, it teaches to fight injustice and to deal justly even with those considered enemies. Faced with such a thorough explanation, Professor Parker finally fell silent. He felt he could no longer contradict Myra's arguments. All his previous objections, which he considered irrefutable, collapsed one by one. The atmosphere in the classroom, once tense, transformed into one of reflection. Many students began to question their ideas about Islam. With a slightly furrowed brow, Professor Parker spoke again. "Why does Islam consider apostasy a crime? Why must someone who decides to leave the faith face punishment?" Mira observed him patiently and replied, "Professor, in Islam, apostasy is not automatically punished unless it is accompanied by political treason or actions that threaten the stability of the community. This rule is not meant to restrict individual freedom of belief, but to protect society from potential risks that could compromise security and collective harmony. On a personal level, leaving the faith is not punishable except when the resulting actions disrupt social stability. Islam places great value on religious freedom," the Prophet Muhammad himself affirmed. "There is no compulsion in religion. Every person has the right to choose and practice their faith, and this is a fundamental principle of Islam." Myra's words were precise and profound. She firmly explained that Islamic rules regarding apostasy aim not to punish the individual but to safeguard social cohesion. She emphasized that Islam values religious freedom and never forces anyone to accept its teachings. Professor Parker then posed another delicate question. "Mira, why in Islam is a woman's inheritance only half that of a man? Isn't this unfair?" Mira responded calmly. "Professor, in Islam, The allocation of inheritance does not reflect superiority or inferiority but corresponds to different responsibilities. Men are obliged to provide financially for their wives and children, whereas women do not have that obligation. Therefore, men receive a larger share, but this does not imply that women are inferior. They retain all their inheritance rights, and in fact, Islam grants them privileges that many cultures of that time did not even consider. Women are respected and recognized as equals to men in many aspects, even if the distribution of property is different. Mira pointed out that the difference in inheritance does not signify injustice, but reflects a fair distribution according to the roles and responsibilities of each family and societal member. Her explanation deeply moved everyone present, offering them a renewed perspective on the place of women in Islam. Professor Parker, although beginning to show signs of weakness, tried to formulate a question that seemed challenging even for someone as knowledgeable as Mira. "Mira," he said in a somewhat hesitant voice, "if God is just and merciful, why is there so much suffering in the world? Why is there so much inequality, violence, and injustice? If God is benevolent, why does He allow these things to happen?" The words hung in the air like a dense shadow. All eyes in the classroom turned to Mira. For many, it was a question that affected both the heart and the mind. Professor Parker had prepared this question intending to challenge Mira, questioning divine justice. However, Mira responded with exceptional calm, looking at him with deep understanding. The professor nodded, and Mira continued in a calm but meaningful voice. "The pain and difficulties in the world are not proof that God does not exist or that He is unjust. Suffering is part of the trials that life presents to humanity. As mentioned in the Quran, Surah Al-Baqarah, verse 286. Allah does not burden a soul beyond that it can bear. Everything we experience, both joy and pain, constitutes a test that reveals who among us are patient and sincere in accepting their destiny." Mira paused briefly and scanned the audience, which remained completely silent, listening attentively. God is not the direct source of suffering. It arises from human actions. We often make mistakes, allow hatred, greed, and ego to guide us. Yet, amid adversity, we discover our strength and find opportunities to learn and grow. She continued with sincere compassion. "If God gave us only happiness without challenges, we would be fragile and would never understand the true meaning of strength. Pain teaches us to draw closer to Him and to fully appreciate life. When we face these trials with patience, the reward we gain is far more valuable. Suffering is not a punishment but a path to draw nearer to God." After her words, a deep silence fell. The students lowered their gazes, reflecting on the wisdom of her message. Professor Parker, who had previously spoken with uncertainty, remained silent. He felt that there was something in Myra's answer that was undeniable. What he had always seen as a sign of divine injustice now appeared to him in a different light. Mira not only transformed his view of God but also touched the hearts of many in the classroom, who admired the clarity and depth of her response. Professor Parker then posed a more philosophical question. "Mira, if God can do everything, why does He test human beings? Why not create a perfect world, without pain or hardship?" Mira looked at him calmly, as if she had anticipated the question. "Professor, God grants us the freedom to choose our own path in life. This world is not perfect because He gave us free will. He did not design a world without trials, because it is precisely these challenges that reveal how much we can grow as human beings. Without obstacles or difficulties, we would never come to truly know ourselves." She continued firmly, "God created this world with all its imperfections so that we have the opportunity to overcome them. In every challenge there is a lesson, in every suffering a strength we can discover. He gives us the ability to choose between good and evil, And trials are the way to show how far we can persevere, act with kindness, and cultivate patience. As she spoke, a deep emotion filled those listening. Her answers were not only logically coherent but also conveyed an essential meaning for life. Professor Parker could no longer find a way to refute her, as what Mira said was understandable both from a philosophical and a spiritual perspective. Suffering, which so many questioned, was now clearly perceived as an inevitable part of the human process of growth and the search for the meaning of existence. Professor Parker tried once more to challenge her with a more complex question. Mira, if God is one, how is it possible that there are so many religions that contradict each other? Why do so many claim to represent the absolute truth? Doesn't this create confusion among people? Mira observed him calmly and, with a slight smile, replied, "Professor, it is true that many religions claim to possess the truth, but Islam teaches that all divine revelations given to humanity form a single message, and that in the beginning, humanity was a single community." The Quran in Surah Al-Baqarah, verse 213 states, "Mankind was a single community, but then they separated." Different religions emerged over time due to differences in interpretation and deviations from the original teachings. She continued, "Islam is not a newly created religion but the culmination and perfection of previous revelations. God sent his messages to guide humanity, but frequently they strayed from his path. Islam came to redirect humanity toward the right path and to complete the earlier revelations." Mira's explanation conveyed serenity. She did not criticize other religions but wisely pointed out that Islam continues the chain of revelation from the time of the Prophet Adam, and that differences between religions arise from interpretations and deviations, while Islam seeks to perfect those divine messages. After this, Professor Parker raised a final question about ethics in Islam. "Mira, if Islam is so equitable, why is polygamy allowed? Doesn't it go against equality between men and women?" Mira showed no surprise. It was a question she expected. She responded firmly, "Professor, polygamy in Islam is not an obligation. It is only permitted under very strict conditions. A man can only marry more than one woman if he is able to treat them justly. Otherwise, it is forbidden." She continued, "Islam permits polygamy only in specific circumstances, such as when a woman becomes widowed or requires protection. In many situations, the norm encourages union with a single woman. The essential thing is that justice is respected. If a man cannot be equitable, polygamy is not allowed." Mira's explanation was precise and thoughtful. She not only clarified Islamic law regarding polygamy but also encouraged the audience to consider the social context behind this rule. Polygamy in Islam is not a mandate but an option regulated through strict responsibilities. With each response, Professor Parker's authority seemed to wane. The confidence he once displayed firmly weakened in the face of Mira's calmness and depth. All those questions he thought impossible to answer now found a clear and just solution. Mira not only demonstrated that Islam is a religion based on peace and equity but also showed that science and faith can coexist without contradiction. Every word Mira spoke radiated exceptional calm. She was not simply a student. She was a vessel of truth, with conviction and a genuine heart. There was no trace of anger or resentment, only a tranquility capable of soothing the hearts and minds of everyone present. When Mira answered the final question, the classroom fell into absolute silence. No one spoke or moved. Both students and teachers were struck by the power of her words. Professor Parker, once confident and arrogant, now displayed visible astonishment. He could no longer ignore the truth Mira had just revealed. Finally, Professor Parker remained silent. He looked at her with a different gaze. No longer challenging, only respectful. He felt defeated, not just by the arguments but by the truth that touched his very core. After a few seconds, he spoke with a trembling voice. "No, I don't know what else to say." He picked up the Quran, which he had previously held with defiance, and now regarded it with deep respect. "Mira, if all this is true, I want to learn. I want to know more." Mira simply smiled softly. She had not come to impose, but to convey the truth. And that day, not only did Professor Parker change, but so did the entire audience. Truth is not imposed with loud voices or arrogant victories. It is revealed through the sincerity and purity that flow from a clean heart.